what is Tavistock? What are some of the horrors that went on there?
The Tavistock is the National Health Service psychotherapy training school. And the JIDS is actually a very small part of the Tavistock. Mm-hmm. So if you thought of a big building with a lot of people having individual therapy, family therapy, group therapy, and then a lot of other people being taught about psychotherapy, that's what the Tavistock is.
Interesting. And what was it that came out a couple of years ago that made it, I guess, infamous around the world?
Well, the Gender Identity Development Service was a long time ago, moved into the Tavistock in the early 2000s. It was quite a small service, and it sort of got bigger and bigger since 2000, say. Mm-hmm. And then what basically happened was, so my wife worked in the Gender Identity Development Service, and she was used to working with people psychologically, and she thought that's what would be going on in the service. And then she was listening to cases, and some of the cases, after quite a few short number of consultations, would be sent off to UCL for medication. She raised questions about this, saying what was going on, and surely these are quite complicated presentations, kids with comorbid symptoms. They may have eating disorders, be on the autistic spectrum, or have ADHD. And it takes a bit of time to sort of unpack what's going on for them, both individually, but also with the family. And she felt they were being moved into a sort of medical pathway too quickly. Mm-hmm. She tried to discuss that with the team and felt that her concerns and questions were not welcome. So after about 6 months, she took it up with the medical director. He then looked into her concerns, and he found that he upheld what she was worried about. He felt there was not enough research, there was not enough outcome monitoring, there wasn't enough rigorous clinical thought about who these kids were, why they were presenting with this particular symptom, what might be going on behind the scenes, and that the whole thing was too rushed. They were being rushed down a narrow medical pathway before proper, thorough psychological work had been done. The thing about that was I was part of the management of the trust, and what we'd usually do is we'd hear about these reports. They'd all be discussed by all the managers in the trust. And Dave Taylor's report, he was the medical director at the time, it basically disappeared. My wife resigned and she left the Gender Identity Disorder Service. She didn't feel she could work with that team. Now, then if you sort of roll on, what happened was I retired from the NHS in 2018. I took up a role on the board of governors. That's a voluntary role. It's not a paid role. And another colleague of mine, probably the best known clinician in the trust, a guy called David Bell, he was approached by staff from the Gender Identity Disorder Service who basically was saying similar things to the concerns that my wife had raised in 2005. He told the trust he'd like to do a report as a governor. He did the report, and then they really didn't like the findings, because the findings basically said we're not looking at these kids psychologically thoroughly, all the things that Sue had raised in 2005. Now, what then happened was the board's job is to oversee the functioning of the trust. Now, for 6 months, I was trying to bring up the fact that these are serious concerns about a very vulnerable group of children. It's an experimental medical treatment. We don't really know what the outcome of these medical interventions are. They're serious. And there wasn't the usual sort of body of evidence that surrounds this sort of medical intervention. Over time, what I realised was that the trust weren't really interested in looking into it. I felt that the whole thing was being buried, and I felt this was negligent on behalf of in the part of the trust. This was a negligent approach. You should take these serious concerns seriously. After all, it's a controversial treatment with a vulnerable group with serious long-term consequences. Now, I'd signed what do you call it? Non-disclosure.
Yeah, NDA.
NDA that basically said I couldn't say anything as long as I was on the board of governors. Right. So I resigned, and then something strange happened. All of a sudden, I was contacted by all sorts of journalists who were already ahead of the curve on this. They had all sorts of questions.
Wow, yeah.
And then I was asked to speak at the House of Lords with a group of clinicians from the States and from people like Stephanie Davis-Arai. Mm-hmm. And what was clear was there were all sorts of concerns, both here and in the States, about the fact that we're basically flying blind with this medical intervention.
What are just quickly some of the most egregious things that have happened to mostly, I suppose, children, were they?
These were all under 18s. The GID service is under 18s, yeah.
What are some of the most egregious things where it's like gone too far and that you've gone, oh, this shouldn't have happened?
Well, the first thing is you put a block on puberty, and the argument was by the Gender Identity Development Service that you can just, if the kid isn't ready for puberty, some kids find it, it's traumatic because there are all sorts of changes, physical changes. There's a change in your psychology. There's a change in your expectations. In a way, you're moving from the relatively protected world that a child lives in to the world that we live in as adults, where there are all sorts of expectations. What are you going to do in the world? What about sexual relationships? Are you going to have these expectations all of a sudden start coming in on you? Now, what happens in adolescence is often that stirs up all sorts of confusions about your body, about your psychology, about who you are, about where you fit in with society. And what I would say is that sort of confusion is part of the adolescent process. Mm-hmm. And you, as parents or as clinicians, you understand, you're sympathetic to the fact this is very turbulent, sometimes quite disturbing, but you sort of support the individual in living through that process. Now, what the Gender Identity Development Service did is basically put a block on puberty, which sort of stops the hormonal development, which stops this turbulent developmental process. The idea being you could sort of, all of a sudden you could lift the lid and then all of a sudden the hormones would kick in. The problem is that it's not quite as straightforward as that. There are all sorts of concerns about the effect of puberty blockers in terms of bone marrow development, brain development. The other thing is you're taking the kid and their turbulent development out of their peer group and sort of, it's like putting them back a year in class.
Yeah.
So it's not the neutral act that it's said to be.
It's experimental, isn't it?
And it's experimental. It's an off-license drug for this treatment.
So puberty blockers, hormones, were they sort of pushing kids towards surgical operations?
No. So the next thing would be you go to cross-sex hormones, and that's when you start to, again, interfere with the sort of normal process of the physiological development of the child. And beyond a certain point, you take cross-sex hormones, it has all sorts of implications for how your body develops. My other point is it has all sorts of implications for how you might struggle with all sorts of things about your identity, your psychology, your sexual preferences. I see it a lot of the time. You see kids, and that really they're terrified of the adult world. They're terrified of the developmental process. They're often quite, now this is a generalization, but the kids we see are often quite fragile, and they feel worried about their identity at the best of the times. You throw in the turbulence of adolescence, and then they feel they're losing control. And in a way, all these drugs sort of put a lid on things.
I see.
So many of them are, again, this is a generalization. So I'm talking about the kids that I see in private practice. They're sort of trying to control the turbulence that's been unleashed by puberty and by sexual development.
That's
that.
fascinating. I'm really fascinated. I really like that you said that, because I know I used to have quite bad obsessive compulsive disorder when I was a teenager. I had to see someone about it. I was flipping light switches on and off all the time and all that kind of thing. And it took a long time to understand the relationship between that and control, and how we all seem to need to control our environment in some way. Like, does that make sense to you? Is that most people need in some way to control their environment?
100%. You know, that a lot of these kids comorbidly, they're on the autistic spectrum, they've got eating disorders, all these things are to do with control of the internal world and the external world.
Yeah. And you can't control everything, and sometimes you have to go through these things and just work with a therapist perhaps, but without all of these drugs. I mean, that was very worrying for you.
Well, one of the things was, the other thing that Hilary Cass mentions in the review is, she talks about it, the American approach, which is affirmation, which has been adopted in this country and in the States. The biggest researcher in the games, Ken Zucker, he is the person that's done most research in this area, and his approach was watchful waiting. That was the old approach. And that has been researched. And basically what it says is, if you stand by these kids, they're going through gender dysphoria and turbulence, something like 80% of them will desist. Their symptoms will desist if you support them and stand by them, and help them get through the turbulence, if you like. Now that approach has been controversially ditched in preference for affirmation, in which you go along with the child or young person's idea that they're born in the wrong body, and that if only they could change gender, then all their problems would be relieved. Mm-hmm.